all for coming. And this is a topic that I sort of backed into. A friend of mine asked me to give a presentation at a conference, and sort of one thing led to another, and ended up publishing a few little articles on this. Very interesting kind of outgrowth of what I do on the Second World War and the impact of the Second World War. But also has a lot of resonance for things that are going on today. This is not something just confined to the past. How many of you actually saw the movie Monuments Men? Okay, good. So it's actually a pretty accurate movie. It's pretty good, pretty well done, based on a book by Robert Edsel. He's done a number of books on that topic. Obviously popular. The movie kind of ends up on a very positive note. A lot of works of art being returned. But one of the works that actually has a cameo in the end of the movie is this one here on the screen. And this is actually a colorized version of a black and white photo. Yeah.
I have a request if you could speak just a little bit louder.
A little bit louder.
A little
okay,
bit louder.
I will try. I'll put on my classroom voice. And maybe if I stand over here on this side, it might be a little better. So this painting was featured at the very end of the movie Monuments Men. And this is, the picture is by Raphael, a very famous Renaissance artist. A portrait of a young man, believed to be a self-portrait of the artist himself, one of a number of self-portraits that he did throughout his lifetime. This was part of a collection of paintings, very famous paintings, at the Czartoryski Museum in Krakow, Poland. It was a private collection. Included a number of other very famous works of art, including Leonardo da Vinci's Lady with Ermine. During the Second World War, Germany invaded Poland and took over the country, looted a lot of the artwork. This particular collection of artwork was taken by a man named Hans Frank, who was Hitler's governor of occupied Poland, probably one of the worst war criminals in the Second World War. I believe one of the top 10 Nazi war criminals. As the war ended and the Allied armies, Soviet armies were approaching, he gathered up all of his loot into a boxcar and tried to get out and get to through Austria into Switzerland. He was caught. The Monuments Men recovered almost all the paintings except for this one. This one is still missing. This is probably the most famous work of art still missing from the Second World War. Conservatively estimated at $100 million. If it did come up for auction, obviously it doesn't. You couldn't auction it off because it actually wouldn't belong to anyone. There were some rumors that it was destroyed at the end of the movie. There's a scene where it looks like it's being destroyed at the end of the movie. The Polish government does believe that this exists still, that it is out there somewhere. They do not believe it was destroyed. Someone does have this. They don't know who, but they have actually, whole teams of people that are looking for this kind of artwork, as a number of other governments do. But I use that as a starting point because although the Monuments Men ends on this very happy note, there's a lot of artwork that remained missing from the Second World War. And I'll talk about a little bit today why some of those artworks are missing, where some of them are. Some of them they're not really missing. We know exactly where they are. We just can't get them. But also how difficult it is to actually return art in many instances. There's lots of works of art that are out there. They may exist somewhere, but there's confusion or disputes over who really ought to get the artwork back. And that's that's sort of where I sort of jump into this. So at the end of the Second World War, obviously one of the things that the Allies did when they established a unit of the Monuments Men, which was part of the Civilian Affairs Department of the Army, and both the British and the Americans and the other Western Allies made a very conscious decision that any artwork that they found in the course of the war would not be treated as war booty. That is, that they weren't just going to take it for themselves. They were going to actually try to give it back. And this is a very laudable thing. This is in accord with international law, but that was not the norm, and it still is not the norm for many wars throughout history. So while the Americans and the British were giving a lot of the works back, our other ally, the Soviet Union, was not. The Soviet Union pursued a very different policy. When they came across artwork, they stole it again. Some of the artwork was German artwork taken from Germany. Others were from different other countries that the Nazis had stolen from. So I call this thieves stealing from thieves. This is two sets of thieves. Now, how much art did the Soviets take? We believe, as a sort of conservative estimate, 2.5 million works, individual works of art, were taken by the Soviet Union and brought to Russia. Most of those works of art are still there today. However, that's only the tip of the iceberg. There are 12 million books that they took. So it isn't just, so when I talk about this, I'm talking about cultural property, not just works of fine art, but book collections, archival collections, archaeological collections, things that were in museums that have a lot of cultural value that aren't necessarily a painting or a sculpture. And in addition to that, hundreds of other collections, archival collections, were taken. And so huge amounts of art are still missing, and most of that art is, as we'll see, still in Russia today. This is one of them. This is the less happy story. This is a work by Degas, Place de la Concorde, late 1890s, early 1890s. Kind of avant-garde painting, a little bit post-impressionist, kind of imitating a photograph in this one. This is one of the works of art that disappeared after the end of the Second World War. Beginning in about the mid-1990s, about 25 years ago, the Russian government started to display works of art at the Pushkin Museum in Moscow and also at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. This was one of them. They have a huge collection of French Impressionist art that is now in their museums. But again, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Like I say, they showed about 100, 120 works of art out of, again, 2.5 million. So there's a huge number of art, a huge collection of artwork that's still kind of missing out there somewhere. But we know this is not just a problem for years ago. This is a satellite photograph taken in 2014, end of 2014. And we know, if you remember your news stories, you probably saw stories of groups like ISIS or the Taliban rampaging through museums and wrecking things and just blowing up the museums and blowing up important archaeological and architectural sites, some of them dating back thousands of years. And remember, the Nazis did the same thing. They burned books, they destroyed works of art that they considered degenerate. However, the Nazis didn't destroy that many works of art. They didn't burn that many books as people think. A lot of those works of art disappeared, were sold on the side, either by top Nazi officials or to finance the German war effort. They were sold often at fire sale prices. So there's a lot of those works of art still circulating. Very similar case with ISIS, the Taliban, pretty much all the different groups now in the Middle East. And while they destroyed lots of works of art, they actually took a lot of them and sold them. And so this has become a tremendous problem. This is known as blood antiquities. You've heard of blood diamonds. These are blood antiquities. These are used to finance the terrorist operations. How much money? We think, sort of one estimate, something like $800 billion of antiquities have been sold. Again, we don't really know. In Egypt, which had a revolution in 2011, right after 2011, about $3 billion worth of antiquities disappeared from Egypt. In Yemen today, which is also undergoing a civil war, at least $1 million. And Yemen is not even nearly as important as some of these areas in the Middle East. And so ISIS took over areas that had ancient civilizations going back, thousands, 5,000, 6,000 years. They took stuff out of the museums. But what they also did was they began to license pot hunters to go out and dig through archaeological sites, and they would sell licenses to these sort of freelance, local people who were, Hungary. It was a civil war. They'd sell licenses to them, allow them to go to these sites with a shovel and a pick and a bucket, and they'd dig stuff out, and they'd sell it, and then ISIS would then tax that as they were going out. So they made money both ways. This is the site of Mari in Syria. This is a very ancient site, dating back about 5,000 years. And you can see, and basically American and international authorities were able to track this in real time. They weren't able to be on the ground, but through satellite photographs, they could take successive satellite photographs, and you can actually see this progression. And all these little things that are circled here are pits dug by looters. Okay, and so they're pretty active, and this is just one. You know, I watched a presentation by some people who are monitoring this internationally, and they would show one after the other, and it's Afghanistan, it's Syria, it's Iraq, and so all this stuff is being looted, and it's providing a tremendous. It's the number 2 source of funding for ISIS, or was the number 2 source of funding for ISIS after illegal oil sales. So it's a huge amount of money, just a tremendous amount of money. So, speaking of antiquities, now I pulled this off of eBay yesterday. This was on eBay yesterday, and it probably is still on there today. Now, about a third, and by the way, you can go to eBay, and you can find it. They have a little pull-down menu, and there's like Near Eastern antiquities, and you can click on that. It'll give you a menu of things that are for sale. So about a third of antiquities that are out there like this are fakes. So, I mean, and in fact, some of these places in Afghanistan and other places, they're actually manufacturing fakes along with the real ones. So one of these 3 that I put up here is probably a fake. And I'm not saying these are stolen. I don't know that. However, you've got a statue supposedly from Afghanistan made of lapis, obviously pre-Islamic, Sanassian. It's probably about 1,500 years old. And this one, they didn't even know what the inscription is, all being sold out of Thailand.
It's cuneiform.
Okay. Yeah, it's a form of cuneiform, but I'm not even sure which form of cuneiform it is. But at any rate, you can find scads of these actually. And it's Thailand, it's Cyprus, there's Roman, there's Greek, because of course places like Afghanistan and Syria had a Greek influence as well, and if they get those to Greece, they can sell them as just a regular Greek artifact. They sell them out of Europe, you see them from the United States, and again, I'm not saying that all the ones on eBay are it's bad. They may be perfectly legit, but I got a question, where is all this coming from, and why is it showing up in places like Thailand or Cyprus? And Cyprus in particular is a well-known money laundering haven for the banking laws are very loose in Cyprus, and these are actually laundered just like any other illegal product. They run them through a process. They hide the or they have ways of hiding the origin, and this is just small potatoes. I mean, the real big stuff is sold privately through private collectors on the dark web. I mean, there's a number of ways that these are being sold. So this is the kind of thing that is still going on. So obviously, after World War II, this didn't necessarily stop, and it's still a major problem. And I'll talk a little bit about attempts at the end to try to curtail this or try to catch the people who are doing it. And it's still pretty difficult. So I wanted to show you a few cases of attempts to get artwork back, and to show you, kind of illustrate how tough this can be sometimes, and how, even though it seems pretty straightforward, I mean, there's a stolen work of art, it's been identified, why can't it get returned? Well, here's some issues. But first I wanted to start out with a success story. And this is a painting by George Pench, who was a student of Albrecht Dürer, a very famous German artist and printmaker from the early 1500s. And this painting, called Holy Trinity, was in the National Gallery in Warsaw from about they acquired it in 1880, and it stayed there until 1939, German invasion. It was taken, disappeared, and at the time, particularly any works that may have had any kind of German connection to them, the Nazis really wanted those, because Hitler wanted to actually create this vast museum. I think it was in Innsbruck, of German art, and he actually had all the detailed architectural plans already, but this was probably going to end up there, but it disappeared at the end of the war, and it turned up in a museum in Miami, the Vizcaya Museum. It's a private museum in Miami. It was donated by the German consul to Miami. It had been the former German consul several years before, who had acquired it from a dealer in Germany along with a number of other works of art, which he donated to the same museum. It was identified as the missing painting. There was the honorary consul of Poland in Miami, Lady Blanca Rosenstiel, was able to facilitate contact with the museum. Obviously, both the U.S. and the Polish government stepped in. The museum did the right thing. They gave the painting back. It returned. Happy end of the story. So the elements of this story is, first of all, this painting, and we'll talk about this in a moment, this painting was hanging in a public museum. Okay, so it belonged to a government. Governments have embassies, lawyers, and they have consuls who can do things. It was in a museum in our country, which respects the rule of law. There were people of goodwill on all sides facilitating it, so things went pretty smoothly. So this is like the optimal, the best case scenario of what happens when a work of art like this that's missing is discovered. And by the way, there's actually a website that the Polish government has a website with about 60,000 works of art that are outstanding. You can actually look them up. They've tried to publicize this, and they have it in English so that anyone can read it. This is another example, a little less happy example. This is the photograph is Professor Victor Bosch and his wife, and they were. Professor Bosch was a very famous professor in France. He was a professor at the Sorbonne, French Jewish professor. And he had a tremendous collection of books. He knew a lot of the leading figures in France before the Second World War, a lot of the famous artists, including Marc Chagall. He had this tremendous collection of books. When the war broke out, he and his wife were dispossessed of all their collections. In January of 1944, both Victor and Ilona were killed by Vichy militia. They were taken out and executed. The book collection that he had, this tremendous library collection, disappeared. This book, by the way, that you see as the front piece it's a biography of Marc Chagall. But you'll notice that Marc Chagall has actually autographed it. He even put a little drawing, very typical, again, very famous early 20th century artist. Even had a little drawing, a little bit risque drawing of a woman with a Star of David above it. So this collection disappeared. It turned up, and if you look at these stamps very carefully, you'll see that they're in Russian, and it actually has a accession date of 1968 on it. This collection of books is now in the National Library of Belarus in Minsk, Belarus. So this was taken by the Soviets, the whole collection taken by the Soviets, and it's now in the National Library of Belarus, and it's not going anywhere. They have decided, and the Russians passed a law, and Belarus has a very similar law, because they operate in a very similar fashion to the Russians, that anything that they took during the Second World War is theirs forever and ever. They passed a law that said that they had given a few collections back, a few little trinkets here and there, but then some Russian lawmakers said, no, it's ours. Now, keep in mind that obviously Russia had suffered great destruction during the Second World War. Their explanation for this is, we lost a lot of our libraries, so we get, this library was there, and so this replaces the stuff that the Germans destroyed when they invaded our country. This is a little bit questionable, because first of all, obviously this came from France, number one. Number two, from actually victims of the Nazis, right? So they're not really taking it they weren't really taking it from Germany. Even if that was legitimate, which, as I'll argue, is not legitimate. We don't steal other people's. I mean, if someone takes something of yours or destroys something of yours, you don't go to take someone else's stuff in compensation, and you don't go and take stuff from their grandchildren or their great-grandchildren. Okay, we don't punish the grandchildren of burglars because we're upset at them. And so this collection of books, again, not a work of fine art, but again, this would be incredibly valuable. This came up on Antiques Roadshow. The people would probably go nuts because it would be so considered so rare. So we have cases, in particular in the case of Russia, where countries do not respect the rule of law, and these works of art are left out there, or cultural works. Now here's another story. This is an interesting story. I came across, as I was doing the research for one of the presentations that I was giving, I came across this interesting story. And it sounds like a pretty feel-good story. The Hungarian rabbi, and this was from 2014, finds 103 stolen Torah scrolls in Russia. Now, Torah scrolls are very important to Jewish communities. It's the actual the work of handwritten scrolls with the Torah on them. They're kept in a place of pride in every synagogue. Some of them are extremely rare, going back, they keep them they're passed down through generations, so some of these hundreds of years old. And many of them are actually works of art in themselves. You look at them, they're beautifully illustrated, incredible calligraphy. So these 103 Torah scrolls, by the way, were taken from in 1944 when the Nazis began mass killing of Jews in Hungary. These Torah scrolls were stolen from the Jewish communities in Hungary. They were put in a warehouse, and apparently at the end of the war, the Soviets scooped them up along with everything else. So it's it's an interesting story. I thought, oh, that's nice. Now, these Torah scrolls were in the Lenin State Archives in Nizhny Novgorod, Russia. Okay. Now, follow along as I'm thinking this through. So Nizhny Novgorod is not exactly a tourist destination in Russia. It's not exactly on the beaten path. In fact, back in Soviet times, foreign travel there was heavily restricted. Why is this rabbi? Why does he show up in Nizhny Novgorod? Why is he there? This archive is not. It's not like a card catalog. You get the card catalog with Torah scrolls, or it's not online. It's like a typical European archive where you have to know what you want and you have to ask them for it in writing, and they come and get it and they bring it to you. Okay, and it isn't necessarily. And this is it's a huge facility. So how did this guy know that these Torah scrolls were here? Did he just randomly show up one day? Maybe not. So that's a coincidence. Who is this rabbi? His name is Shlomo Koz, and he's not just an ordinary Hungarian rabbi. In fact, he's born in Pittsburgh, by the way. But he's a Chabad. He's one of the two most important rabbis in Hungary. He also happens to be the chief rabbi of the Hungarian army. Aha. And so he's actually a close ally of the current Fidesz government in Hungary. Here he is. He's signing an agreement with one of the other Hungarian ministers. So this is not just some random guy. This is a very important person, probably the most important Jewish figure in Hungary. So what's going on here? Well, clearly someone told him that these were there. The only people that could have told him were the Russians. And so he shows up, and this nice little story pops up. But what's going on here is that the Russians are attempting, if you follow the politics in Europe, they're attempting to cut a wedge into Central Europe. And the Hungarians have been a little more willing to listen to the Russians than some of the other Central European countries. And so the Russians are kind of dangling, they're kind of dangling this out as a kind of prize to sort of get the Hungarians to do something, not clear what it is, just to be more favorable toward the Putin government. And in fact, there was another Hungarian collection, actually from a Protestant library, a very famous Protestant library that had been taken, was at the same archive in Nizhny Novgorod, which the Russians returned several years earlier, prior to this. And again, as an effort to sort of lure. So here's works of art that are being used as pawns, right, in a political game. Now, I haven't quite figured out where these Torah scrolls are. I do know they're still in Russia, and What seems to have happened is that, for whatever reason, the Russians decided, no, they're not going to return them after all, even though they have this whole little PR thing going on here. And so, but they were given to possibly a Jewish community in Moscow to take care of. But they're probably still kind of under the purview of the Russian government. So they've been sort of given back to a Jewish community, but not the ones that was taken. And again, here we have works of art, works of cultural significance that were they weren't German in any way, shape, or form. Victims, obviously people who were victimized by the Nazis and not being returned. So now I've been going after the Russians, but it's not just the Russians, as it turns out. Even countries where people respect the rule of law, where it's generally upheld, particularly where it comes to things like artwork, are willing on occasion to bend the rules in their own favor. There's a very famous book actually called Lady in Gold about and this is in Vienna actually, a very famous painting by Gustav Klimt, same title, which belonged to a Jewish family, and a number of artworks, very well-known artworks, were owned by private Jewish families in Vienna prior to the war. Those families fled when the Nazis took over. The works of art were taken, and they're still in Austria, they're in Vienna, they're in a museum, but they're not given back to the families. And the book is about this lady who was one of the descendants, or one of the relatives actually of the family, who worked to get her family's painting back, and she managed to succeed, but only after a lot of struggle. This lady, the lady you see on the top, is Dina Babbitt. She died about 7 years ago in Los Angeles. She lived in Los Angeles. She was born Dina Gotlibova, and she was Jewish from Czechoslovakia. She and her mother were deported to Auschwitz, along with other Jews, and she came to the attention, she was an artist of some skill. She came to the attention of the Nazi authorities. She managed to trade her artistic skills for better treatment for both her and her mother. She went to work for Josef Mengele, the so-called angel of death at Auschwitz, who was conducting these kind of inhuman experiments and kind of weird racial experiments. And Mengele employed her to paint pictures or draw pictures of gypsies. These were Roma people because he had black and white photography, but he wanted to get their skin tones exactly right because he was obsessed with their skin tones, among other things. And so he needed an artist, and so he employed this lady to do that for him. As a result of, she did get better treatment, her mother got better treatment, they both survived the war. She left, of course, Europe, came to the United States as a refugee, settled, and had a fairly successful life as an artist in Los Angeles. In the early 1970s, the State Museum in Auschwitz, which is arm of the Polish government, discovered a number of her drawings, including the ones you see here. Now, she wanted to get these back. These were her artworks, and she wanted them back. And the museum said no. They said, well, it's our job is to interpret the Holocaust, to explain the Holocaust. These are important documents. They document a German crime. We want to keep them. And these are the only, in some cases, the only records of these people, these Roma people who were, after they were drawn, they were killed. And so she went through a multi-year, in fact, her heirs are still fighting this out. The drawings are still in the museum at Auschwitz. And so they're claiming that their right to interpret the history of the Holocaust takes precedent over her rights as an artist. Okay, so how do you decide that? What's the right thing to do in this case? It's at a stalemate. In fact, she's gone to Congress. They had actually members of Congress in the U.S. here, wrote letters, and there was, and that's been going on for about 40 years. Her heirs are it's still an open case. And so even in and this is an institution that is set up to remember Auschwitz. People visit it every year. It's one of the most important sites of remembrance And yet, even in this case, they're not willing to even talk to this woman or her family. Okay. Here's another case. It's an even more unfortunate case. Bruno Schultz was a very famous Polish writer and illustrator. He was Jewish. He lived in a town called Drohobych, which was in eastern Poland at the start of the war. It became part of Ukraine at the end of the war because the boundaries were moved. This became part of the Soviet Union. He was Jewish, but he never left his side. He wasn't particularly religious. His works, his books are read in most schools in Poland today. He's one of the most famous modern authors in Poland. During the war, he's also an illustrator. His works are kind of surrealist. And during the war, he was put into the ghetto in Drohobych, and along with his family. But he came to the attention of a local Nazi official, local Gestapo official. And this Gestapo official had a house, and he had a mistress and children with his mistress, and he wanted Schultz to paint the walls of the nursery. So he hired Schultz, and he protected Schultz to paint the walls of the nursery, and he painted, among other things, the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and scenes from Hansel and Gretel. In fact, it's real interesting because he actually painted, when he did the faces, he drew the faces of Jewish people who were being killed in the same town. And of course, the Nazi officer didn't know that. However, this Nazi officer there was another Nazi officer in the Gestapo who he was having a rivalry with, and a lot of these Nazi officers they'd save particular Jews to be their kind of servants. This other Nazi officer had a Jewish dentist. Apparently, I guess the Gestapo needed a lot of dental work, but the guy who was protecting Schultz, named Felix Landau, got mad at the other Nazi official and went and killed his Jewish dentist. In revenge, the other officer killed Schultz. Okay, so war ends, murals are forgotten, they're covered over with plaster for many, many years. About 12 years ago, a filmmaker who was doing a film on the life of Schultz managed to track these down and uncover them, create a huge sensation. And actually about a month after that discovery was revealed to the public, a group from Yad Vashem in Israel showed up. And they cut the murals off the walls. Most of them, not all of them, had been uncovered, and took them off to Israel, where they are now in Yad Vashem, which is a important, by the way, very important Holocaust memorial site in Israel. It's the main Holocaust memorial site in Israel. This was done against Ukraine. This is part of Ukraine now. Done against Ukrainian law. First, the Ukrainians said they violated our law. And they started an investigation, and then mysteriously they dropped the investigation and said, it was actually a gift. As you know anything about Ukraine and their politics, it's a little dodgy. Yad Vashem says, well, she's Jewish. The Poles don't deserve it. The Ukrainians don't deserve it. We deserve it. Those people are a bunch of anti-Semites anyway, so it's ours. But they actually didn't take the whole composition, so part of it is still actually at the location. So here's someone who had nothing to do with Ukraine throughout his life. There was no Ukraine, and was a major figure in Polish art and literature. Does it belong in Poland? He lived his entire life in this town, however. He never left this town. He was almost like a recluse. And all of his books are set in this town. Should it remain in the town? What rights do the Ukrainians have? What rights does Israel have? What rights does Poland have? Okay. They were all in some sense victimized by the Nazis. So no one can say, well, we were victimized by the Nazis and you weren't. The Jews were victimized more, and of course Schultz was a Jew. He died because he was Jewish, even though he wasn't really practicing. So where does this artwork belong? Who's going to decide, right? There's no legal claim. He has no heirs. So there isn't someone who can come along and say, legally, it belongs to us because he's our, great-great uncle. Doesn't have any known living relatives. So these are all moral claims. We suffered, so we get this work of art, and you don't. Or so how do you judge? How do you figure out where those works of art go? And this is what makes it so difficult. This is why, you know, the Monuments Men provides this really nice kind of neat and tidy picture, but in fact it's a lot messier than that. Because in some cases we don't know where things are going or where they should go. Now there are efforts to get back works of art, both from the World War II and the present. This is one of them. This is it's actually a very interesting legal finding, those of you who are lawyers and know the law. This is actually a court case that was filed in Washington. It's United States of America versus one gold ring carved with a gemstone, an asset of ISIL discovered on electronic media of Abu Saif, president of ISIL Antiquities Department, and et cetera, et cetera. This is actually one of the rings that they found. So what they're actually doing is they're suing. They're opening a court case against the object. They don't have the object. It's all they have is a picture of it and a little description of it. But the reason they do this, and it's actually quite clever, is if this ever comes up in any auction, this cannot now come up in any museum. It can't be laundered, in other words. And so it has to. So if someone buys this, they have to keep it secret because there's an international warrant out for the arrest of this ring, literally. And that's in a sense the way it's so it's a very because obviously this guy they can't bring. In fact, I think he's dead now, but they can't bring him to he's outside of American justice or outside of international justice, but they can prevent this object from going very far. So anyone who buys it has to keep it underground and cannot display it. And part of the reason collectors buy things is because they want to show them off. And so anyone who buys this and wants to show it off is going to have to be very, very careful because they could get in trouble. So there are ways that this can be done. But a lot of the works of art remain hidden. And for works of art that are dug up, and some of these works of art, by the way, with all the stuff that's going on in Afghanistan and the Middle East, things that are taken out of museums are easier to track, or even private collections, because there's usually a paper trail. Even in fact, one of the things that they did when they looted these museums was they tried to destroy a lot of the records. But even so, there's usually photographs, and not all of them are at the museum. So they have ways, so something that's in a museum might be hidden and might disappear for long periods of time, but at least there's a record of it. Okay, the stuff that's being dug up by these freelance pot hunters, it's been in the ground for 3,000 years. Who's going to track that? Okay, who's going to know whether it's legit or not legit? Okay, so there's tremendous problems. This is really almost, some of this is virtually untraceable. So it's really tough to, and again, they try to get creative and do things like this as a way to at least put some boundaries around it. And they do recover stuff, but even like the FBI, which has an art crimes unit, and it's pretty well funded, but like UNESCO and those other agencies, they really don't have a huge amount of staff. There's some actually individual detectives who people hire to track stuff down. And of course, it's not just, there's places in Asia, for example. Cambodia was a big one during the conflicts in Cambodia, and stuff still coming out of Cambodia that was taken illegally. And of course, people will go even in areas that aren't war zones, that will take and steal stuff. But in war in particular, it's very hard to track this stuff. And so it's one of the great tragedies of the Second World War and of our own time. We tend to think of the period after the fall of the Roman Empire as the Dark Ages. The barbarians, right, at least in popular imagination, came in and they sacked Rome and they destroyed all this stuff. Well, what happened in the Second World War? The barbarians, in a sense, came in and destroyed all this stuff. 2.5 million works of art gone. And a lot of this stuff, actually the stuff in Russia, especially like the book collections, we don't know how it's being cared for. We have some anecdotal evidence that some of the huge libraries of rare books that are just sitting in warehouses rotting away because no one's caring for them. They don't have the resources to care for them. Even the Hermitage, which is one of the major museums of Russia, has been asking. One of the reasons they started to put those works on display was to try to get donations from the West to help them, care for the works of art that they stole from. If that sounds like logic to you. So it is, it is a pretty, it's kind of like the Wild West in a lot of ways. And a lot of that stuff is still out there. Will it ever come back? I don't know, probably not. But it is, we tend to think of our own age being fairly enlightened and look back at the Dark Ages, but maybe we're in our own dark age. I don't know. Not to depress you guys too much. But. So if you guys have any questions or comments or anything like that, I'd be happy to entertain those. I've talked to you long enough. Yes, sir.
How does something like, from what little I know about collecting things, provenance, knowing where it came from, it seemed to me that without that, the object has relatively little value. Am I wrong about that?
Obviously, provenance will increase the value, but a lot of the collectors, they're not in it for the love of history. These are usually people who they have collections in their homes. They want to show off. It's more about that. And in some cases, these can be identified. You can look at, you can actually have an expert come in and authenticate it for you. You can't necessarily establish a provenance because that probably doesn't exist. Especially if you're dealing, if we're talking about illegal dealings, chances are they're not going to. You ask the provenance, you're asking one question too many of your source. So.
Like the case with the Bruno Schultz murals and that kind of thing, where you have several different people who are sort of competing to get ownership or control of it. Is there any kind of an arbitrator or adjudicator? I mean, do you take it to an international court? Do you go to The Hague? I mean, how's that been?
And who's going to enforce that?
Okay.
Nice law. But, you got to have someone enforce it. And like with the Russians, who's going to, you can take the Russians to the Hague. It becomes, and certainly with the Schultz thing, it became, it was the Ukrainian government ultimately said, okay, probably got some money on the side. Someone in the Ukrainian government got money on the side.
But it went to Yad Vashem.
Yeah, but part of it is still in Ukraine. That's the sad part. It's actually damaged. They actually damaged it because part of the composition is still there.
And of course, it's a war zone, so.
Yeah. Well, and this part of Ukraine is, and this part is relatively peaceful. This is the western part, but still.
I have a hard time fathoming why somebody would pay $100 million for a painting. But also, if that's true, I wonder why someone wouldn't pay $100 million to Ukraine or Belarus or the Hermitage to get those endangered collections out of there so they could preserve.
Sometimes it's not about the money; it's about the prestige. Yeah. Now, again, I can't speak. I mean, like I said, that's only with the Portrait of a Young Man. That's only speculative.
It happens, though.
Yeah, but a lot of it is it's the perception of value. It's and when they things and artwork is, if you follow that, it rises and falls depending on the popularity and the value that the intention that the artist is getting and those kinds of things, so that they can rise and fall. But a lot of this is much more about pride and why would $100 billion probably wouldn't cover the stuff that's in the Hermitage, but also it's very it's very controlled politically. I mean, Putin doesn't need any more money. He's got plenty of money. He doesn't need any. The Russian people might need money. The Hermitage might need money, but Putin doesn't, and he's going to make the decisions. So he has more than enough. And
so why does he want all these documents? They can't mean anything to him.
Because he's got.
You don't.
And you don't. That's why. It's often hard for us to fathom a sort of zero-sum mentality, but this is really what people have, and that someone like Putin or even the Chinese leadership, it's not like we're going to strike a deal where we can both get something out of it. It's like if we're gonna negotiate, I have to win, you have to lose, because that's the way it is. And the only reason I would give you something is because I'm too weak. And so the only reason, and that's when the Russians did start to give things up, and they gave a few things, like I said, here and there, it was in the period when the early 90s, when Russia was really falling apart.
Gorbachev.
Yeah, and part of Gorbachev and into Yeltsin. But once, toward the end of the Yeltsin, they began to really clamp down. But it's also the mythology of the Great Patriotic War, that we were the victors, we defeated the Nazis. That myth helps prop up the Russian government. And you cut that, and that seems maybe to us kind of silly, but that's incredibly important. And cut away that myth, you cut away the legitimacy of the government. Because, I mean, you can make people suffer, but at least it's for this grand cause, and it helps. All those Russians that died through, whether in the war or through by their own government.
20 million.
Well, supposedly, well, it's not really 20 million, but it's no one really knows. The 20 million number just got thrown out there, but they killed a lot more of their own people by themselves.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, no, they probably 40 million of their own people
That's
got killed, and maybe 20 million got killed during the war. But in a sense, that myth provides compensation for all those losses. We don't have to explain we don't have to explain why we killed all of our own people, because after all, we did this great thing.
40 years ago, I was at the Hermitage, and the guards were little old red-haired ladies that slept, and they had, I don't know how many Rembrandts on like bulletin boards, and you could just move them like this. And do they take care of them any better now?
Yeah, probably some of the Rembrandts they do. Now, one of the things I should point out is that the Hermitage had a great collection of art before the war. Okay, Russian nobility and the czars acquired a lot of Western artwork, and so some of these works of art that they put on display recently were not on display. Those were, and so some of those had been acquired legitimately prior to the revolution. Okay, they may have been taken from private families by the Russian government, but that's a whole other ball of wax. And the government was stealing things from 1918 onward, but only from private individuals and their neighbors. But yeah, part of the problem is no, and the short answer is no. There's a lot of works of art. There's a strong suspicion that a lot of the works of art are not being well cared for. The books certainly are not. They just don't have the staff, and some of it isn't just the Hermitage. It's in other museums all around Russia.
Because these were just on like a bulletin board.
Yeah.
It just moves back and forth.
Oh.
And we were stumbling
Rembrandts.
around the basement where there weren't any guards. And there was a statue that I thought, gee, that's a really nice one. And it was a Michael,
Michelangelo?
yeah, Michael.
Could well be.
Yeah, it was really a great
Yeah. Yeah.
statue. But it wasn't displayed at all.
Well, it was a very different, it's often a very different attitude toward displaying works of art too. It's not necessarily, I think they're much more professional now from everything I've seen in terms of display and control of partly because Russia's a lot more open. Back then the borders were closed, and if you had grabbed a Rembrandt and taken it with you back to the hotel, chances are you wouldn't have much of a chance of ever getting out of Russia. So there were other layers of security involved in that. So.
From the book Monument Men, how much are some of those salt mines still, are there places that they hid the Aryans still undiscovered?
Possibly. There's a whole, in fact, Larry was asking about the gold trains before. There's probably still stuff, there's stuff that's missing still. We don't know where it is. The Amber Room, for example, the famous Amber Room from Catherine the Great's palace is missing. Who's got it? Is it? Some of it was destroyed, so we know that, and things were because German cities were being bombed. Like Dresden got completely flattened and burned. Tremendous amount of artwork in Dresden that got destroyed, and so it could have been destroyed. There's probably places still they haven't found. Most of the salt mines where a lot of those works of art were found, those have been thoroughly explored though. So, but again, some of them they're vast caverns, and you know, there's still, I mean, there's archaeologists that are working on that now.
More of a comment, but or an interesting anecdote related to this. As I'm the registrar up in Juneau at the Alaska State Museum, and I got an email from a professor at Berkeley 2 years ago. She was doing research on Nazi looted art and came across letters from one of the monuments men to the governor of Alaska.
Oh.
And saying, hey, we found this cool Northwest Coast stuff in a salt mine. It would look great in Juneau. You want it? And we don't have the answers,
Okay.
The replies, but you can
Interesting.
still see, you can go online to the Berlin Museum of Ethnography, and you can see those collections that were
Okay.
there. They were collected in the 1880s, 1890s, and sort of rushed for Northwest Coast stuff, but it was interesting,
Yeah.
like sideline to think that there was a moment when they thought we could loot this stuff back.
Right, and it was I mean, obviously the Americans British did a much better job than the Soviets did, but there were also plenty of American servicemen. I mean, stuff was up for grabs. I mean, there was just stuff all over the place. You know, anything small, you stick it in your backpack and take it home with you on the Liberty ship. I mean, stuff pops up, and oh yeah, some granddaughter of some guy in the army had some painting or some little sculpture or something that ended up being moderately important or valuable. So those kinds of things. But yeah, they took actually the most famous archaeological collection that the Russians took was the Henrik Schliemann, the gold that he discovered in Troy. That had been in a museum in Berlin. It's now in St. Petersburg as well. So it wasn't just fine art, but it was. And by the way, stuff still pops up. I mean, a couple of years ago, this guy in Germany passed away, and they went into his apartment. They discovered hundreds of modernist paintings. His dad had been one of the people who was selling stuff for the Nazis on the sly. War ends. He's got this. Literally, he had talk about the care of paintings. These were stacked up, in his apartment. It's just. He never did anything with them. He never sold them. He just liked them because they were. He loved the art. I mean, a lot of the people actually loved the art. Yeah. And,
I was wondering if, I was reading about the concentration camps and stuff. They pried a lot of the gold fillings from the Jewish prisoners and stuff. And I was wondering, did the Allied forces account for any of that, of the gold Nazi bars that were they smelted down?
they discovered gold bars.
Gold bars.
Where did they come from?
Who knows, right?
Yeah. I mean, some of them may have come from that, but they took people's wedding rings. They took everything.
Well, it's not just wars. I was economic development director for the Makah tribe, and we had a great push to get artifacts for Northwest art back from the Peabody Museum. And they were willing to give it. We just needed, there was an effort, and it came back to the Makah Museum. This is in Mia Bay in Washington. And there's been a long time, and it's still going on, of repatriation of native art
Right. And
to the Northwest.
in our area, obviously, Alaska's been very active. in
Yeah.
that. But here's the thing, though. It requires a organization with some resources to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, to approach. If it was like, hey, that's my uncle's bentwood box that went missing, when the Harriman expedition showed up, in Southeast Alaska, that it's like, who are you and how can you prove that, and put that in writing. Talk to us later. But if it's See Alaska and they come in, and that's the thing with this artwork. If there's a government behind it that is interested in bringing it back, they've got all of the resources. They've got the lawyers. They've got the accountants. They can give you the documentation. It's a whole different story. That's the sad part, is that a lot of these works of art were in private collections, and the heirs might be dead. They might be living in somewhere in California or Alaska or wherever. How are you gonna track all that down? They might have lost all their family records. They might have lost everything, their photographs, their letters, everything. How can you prove that was in your grandfather's, book collection. That's the thing. And so it really takes, sadly, rather than justice, it's more about, how much clout can you bring to bear. And See Alaska can bring the clout, kudos to them for doing that. But that's kind of what it requires, unfortunately.
There was an object that showed up on Antiques Roadshow 4 or 5 years ago, a Northwest Coast item. It was a collection of a family whose forebears had been missionaries up, someplace up, one of those villages up by Juneau. And someone up there saw that show and went, aha. And the story that came out was that missionaries had convinced the natives that these objects were not Christian, they were evil, but they were good enough for the missionary to take home with them to Ohio and treasure and keep for some generations and show up on.
And in some cases, with some of those individual works, people sold them. They said, well, we don't need this. We don't need this anymore. In our own area, we know that things don't necessarily pass from father to son or mother to daughter. They pass to aunts and uncles, and so it may have, the son and the daughter may have acquired it. And they may sell it off because it's not that valuable to them. But the nephews and the nieces are going like, hello. So all kinds of things happen. It was very painful period of time. And that's why, one of the things that this has been great that you've seen happen is that when they do find these things in the museums, they'll have someone make another version of it or a copy of it to go into the museum so that culture can still be appreciated by the people going to the museum, but the original comes back to where it belongs. That's like when these optimal situations, but unfortunately that's not always the norm. That's the unfortunate part.
Just another comment. French and German museums these days seem to be very receptive to the idea of giving back to, particularly in Africa. I just wonder if do you think that's an outgrowth of this experience with Nazi looted art and this sort of reckoning?
Yeah,
that they've come?
I think so. I think that's more, with the Nazi looted art. Again, most of the French museums got their stuff back. Museums in other parts always didn't, but I think it is. One of the things is that like I say, you have works of art, and sometimes one argument that museums will make, and I haven't heard the Russians do this yet, but they're probably thinking it pretty soon. Well, these works of art are so valuable, they're such important works, they don't really belong to anyone, they belong to humanity. And so we're just holding on to them, and we're not giving them back. There's actually a collection of German manuscripts in Poland, including there was an original score of Magic Flute by Mozart. There was a number of very important, mostly not fine art, but mostly things like that. And basically, it's still in Warsaw, and that was one argument the Polish government made. Well, these, Beethoven or Mozart, they belong to all of humanity, so we'll just hold on to them for now. They put them on display. They let the Germans come in and take a look at them, and of course they make the argument like the Russians did well, which they did. 95% of the works of art in Poland disappeared. Cities were, flattened, and literally all the buildings destroyed. And so they're like, you can see why someone would say, we suffered these terrible losses, and they were, why shouldn't we have a nice museum in our capital city with some nice stuff in it? Just because you came in and destroyed it, why should you get all your nice stuff back? But is that right? Is it just? I don't really think so.
So is there any estimate of the amount of items in private collections versus government?
Where? In the worldwide or?
Worldwide.
I couldn't give you that. I wouldn't know. Some of it is obviously tremendous. Of course, it's because it's private. You don't necessarily know.
You're not
So,
so,
And the profile of the person who would be buying it is extremely rich.
could be extremely rich. I mean, there are, people who, invest all of their life savings in it. You've got a lot of, that's, like, tech boom was great for the art market. So, these tech entrepreneurs, they've got money coming. But, there are people in the world, and they're not bad people, they just have lots of money. You literally can't get rid of it. I know a very wealthy person, I don't know him personally, but I know people who know him very well. And this was, he made scads of money selling pizza, actually. But he had something like $900 million, and he decided basically he wanted to die with nothing. Okay, he wanted to give it all away to charity. He wanted to do charitable things with it. He'd been reading the Bible. The rich man doesn't get to, like he wanted to unload it all before he died. He literally couldn't, because the money just sitting in the bank made more than he could possibly ever give away.
That's
I mean,
what
he
happens.
So what's the name?
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
hard.
he kind of. I don't know what he's decided to do. I think he's got a will. He's going to will it off to somebody. But but then of course also when you're that wealthy, everyone wants to be your friend too, and you have to be very careful because as soon as they know you're giving away your money, it's like, hey bud, So there are people like that are also constantly besieged by everyone and their brother who wants to hand out.
On the, as far as the repatriation or the returning of what the Allied forces were able to recapture, were there any issues as far as the state and the condition of artifact or arts and being returned? Were there any percentages of the art pieces that had to be go through like repair or
Yes.
reconditioning or preservation?
Yeah, that was common because of course they were put in boxcars, they were put in salt mines, they were carted, hither and yon. In a lot of cases, they really did try to, the Germans knew these were valuable and they boxed them up and they. But one of the things, actually, it's kind of missing from the movie, that there was a French woman. She's played by Kate Blanchett in the movie, Rose Vallard, who was an art historian in France. Who basically she was one of the she was a volunteer curator at one of the museums, and when the Germans were taking all of this stuff, they were helping. They got her to help with the paperwork, but she actually recorded a lot of the information, and what was being stolen, when it was being stolen, what condition it was in, and it was actually those records that allowed them to trace a lot of the works of art from France. Stolen, but she kind of gets a little overlooked in the movie. She was the one who actually told them where a lot of the work was probably stolen from and where it had been sent to, because they actually watched the trains. And by the way, a lot of the resistance movements they risked tremendous amounts because she was part of the French resistance as well, and to rescue and record some of this stuff. And people lost their lives, trying to record this information and to let people know, at least in some cases rescue actual works of art. So. Thank you all.
Thank you.
We still have room.